Good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be here. This is my first live stream, so I'm super excited. Um, so, my name is Ashley Johnston, and you are here tonight for AP Language Synthesis. I just want to share a little bit about myself first before I get started, since this is my first time, so many of you don't know me. I am a AP Lang teacher in the state of Alabama. I teach at one of the largest high schools here in the state of Alabama, and I've been teaching AP language for 3 years. I do have an undergraduate degree in journalism, public relations, and so I love writing, I love researching, annotating, following current events. So this AP Lang is totally my jam. I super geek out about it, so I hope that you'll bear with me when I get really nerdy about things that I'm sharing. But tonight we are going to dive into the synthesis prompt. And we're going to look at what is synthesis. We're going to talk about the prompt itself so that you have some ideas of how to break that down. And then we're going to look at some actual material. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we dive straight into that, I would like to share with you our social media profiles. So you can follow at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And so I highly suggest for each and every one of you to do that. We have some things coming up this week or within the next week. Next week, I am going to be sharing a new stream called Article or Articles of the Month. And so I am hoping to do that every month from now on. We do already have it on the books for November as well. So I'm really excited to do that. We will share some timely articles, some current events. We will do some rhetorical analysis of those articles. And then we will talk about how you can incorporate that information if you were writing an argument on your test. We also have rhetorical analysis thesis statements coming up on the 10th of October. So those are some things that are coming soon in the world of AP Lang. So please join us for those streams as well, and we will be glad to see you there. Okay, so what we are going to do tonight is we are going to really dissect, first of all, the synthesis prompt page, because I feel really confident in your ability to be able to really dissect that prompt page and understand what's going on and what they're asking you to do. And I really feel like that has a huge potential to make or break you whenever you're writing your essay. So we're going to look at a prompt page, and it has been changed with some stable wording, and we'll talk about what that means. And then I'm going to give you some reminders about source information. Just like a research paper or anything else you were writing, you would have to cite your information, and you also have to do that on synthesis. So we're going to talk about how to do that so that you get the points for that, because that is a requirement. We're going to talk about some other requirements and a little bit about the rubric and how they're going to score you on this essay. And then we're going to look at some sources and talk about citing directly and indirectly. And then finally, we're going to look at a thesis statement, a couple of thesis statements that earned the thesis point, and then one that did not. If you have any questions while I am streaming, if you want to go ahead and type them over in the question box, you'll see it at the bottom. It says ask a question. I also put a poll down there just to gauge interest to see if anyone would be interested in seeing a live writing of this actual prompt or a different synthesis prompt. So I'm hoping that, we can dive into the prompt page and the requirements today, and then maybe later we can get into a situation where we live write that. So, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. So synthesis was added to the AP language test in an effort to really mimic the research that happens in English Comp 101. And the idea is that you synthesize material. And so synthesize is the act of combining several elements of research to make a point. So I'm sure that you have written research papers in your ELA classes. You've had requirements on how many sources you had to incorporate. You've had to go out and find those sources, make sure they're credible, and then synthesize that information to justify the argument or the point that you are trying to make. Now, as you see on my slide, it says most importantly to make your point. And so the biggest thing that we have to remember as we are writing a synthesis essay is that the essay is our argument. So when I sit down to plan out what I'm going to write or to think about my argument, the idea is that I'm using the sources they give me to help justify my point that I want to make. And one mistake that we make a lot of times is that we allow the sources to dictate what our point is. And that lends itself to summary a lot, and we definitely don't want to do that. We want to do analysis, we want to do argument, and we want to be making our point. So keep that in mind as we go through these, that you should always be using the materials that you are given to back yourself up, okay? All right, so at the beginning of your free response questions on the AP Lang exam, you will have 15 minutes to read. So you will take your multiple choice portion of your exam, and then you will be given a break. And then after that break, when you come back, your time will begin, but you will have 15 minutes of what they call reading time. Now, it is not a requirement that you only read during this time. So I know there are some teachers who, if they give you this reading time in the classroom, they force you just to read. And I do that as well with my students, just to get them used to what they can do with that amount of time. So definitely use that 15 minutes of time to your advantage. Keep in mind that you're going to have 6 or 7 sources to read. And you'll notice whenever we get to sources on this stream that some of them are really lengthy. And so that 15 minutes is really there to serve you in being able to read those sources and gather what material you can from them before you start writing. Okay, so definitely plan on using that time. Another way to use that time, if for some reason you make it through the sources and let's say you have 4 or 5 minutes left, is that you can go ahead and preview the rhetorical analysis and the argument prompts, maybe make a few annotations. And that way, once you're done writing that synthesis, you already kind of have an idea of what's coming down the line. That reading time needs to begin with your prompt page. So a lot of times on standardized tests, we are told that you don't really have to pay attention to the directions or the instructions because they're always the same and you can just kind of glance over them. And that is not really true in terms of the prompt page on your synthesis exam, okay? So without an understanding of what to write, you can't determine a plan of how you're going to write that. So make sure you begin that 15 minutes with the prompt page. So on your prompt page, you will have several sections of information. And so we're going to break this down so that you understand what each of those paragraphs consist of. And the great thing is that they're all the same. So they're not going to be on the same topic every time, but like where it says first paragraph exigence, your first paragraph is always going to give you insight into the exigence on whatever the topic is for that particular prompt. Okay, so first of all, you're going to figure out why this issue matters and connect it to the world you live in. So that first paragraph is going to give you the issue at hand, and it's going to give you some background information about why that particular issue, topic, subject is important. Okay. And what do we need to do? What do we need to think about? And so that kind of is the first opportunity you get to wrap your brain around what is this subject or this topic that I'm going to have to be writing on. Okay. And we're going to break down each paragraph, and then I'm going to show you what they actually look like. Okay. So your first paragraph is your exigence, or your topic, or your why is this important. Your second paragraph is going to be your actual prompt. Okay. So this is what it's going to say. So it'll tell you to carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. And what they mean by introductory information is going to be the citation at the top of the page. So you will have a box at the top of each source, and it will give you the source information. It'll tell you where it was published, who published it, if it's a magazine article, if it was on the web, if it's in a journal. And so you'll be able to really gauge the leanings and the bias maybe and the issues associated with each of those sources. So keep in mind that they are providing you this information. So sometimes we tend to think, okay, if I was going to go out and search for these sources, I would have to really think critically about whether or not they were good sources to prove the points that I'm trying to make. But in this scenario, they're giving me the sources. So doesn't that mean that they're all good sources? And we tend to think that way, but we still need to be a little bit critical about where that information is coming from. So it depends, obviously, which sources you're going to use based on what you want to write. And so something that comes from a certain journal or a certain website, maybe based on the audience of that, is going to help you make a counter argument better than it will help make your initial argument. So just think critically whenever you're reviewing that citation information about where it's coming from. So that will be your second paragraph, and they have shortened this a lot. So your synthesis used to be like this, okay, and it was much longer. It had a lot of information. So you can kind of see here, lots of information. My paragraphs are pretty lengthy, and they have really shortened this up. So now you're just going to have really, it says paragraphs because they're separated, but they're like sentences. So it's going to be very concise. That is a plus, in my opinion, because it allows you to get through it more quickly. And so you have more time to really spend looking at your source information and annotating it rather than spending a lot of time working through that prompt page and trying to dissect what they're telling you. Okay, so after that initial sentence, so let me go back. This will be your first sentence. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. That's your first sentence in your second paragraph. And this is where the stable wording comes into play. So the synthesis essay used to be a situation where they would ask you several different things. So you may be asked, what are the implications of this particular topic? You may be asked, if we were to analyze the roles of libraries in the future of our country, what would they look like? You might be asked to determine whether a dress code was a good idea for students, but they weren't all worded the same. So if you were to misunderstand what the prompt was asking you to do, for example, on the library prompt, the idea was to analyze what role libraries would play in our community in the future. And so if students didn't analyze the role in the future and instead they talked about libraries now or what role libraries have played in the past, then they didn't really answer the question. So I feel like this is a big bonus for you guys, that now it's going to be worded the same no matter what the issue is. Okay, so it's always going to say, write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops your position on. Now, the next part is in italics because that's the part that's going to change based on what the topic is that you're answering, okay? But the part that says develops your position on will never change. It will always say develops your position on, okay? Which means that you can say, I have a positive, have a negative, I want to qualify. So the notion that school dress codes are discriminatory, towards females. Yes, I believe school dress codes are discriminatory towards females. No, I believe school dress codes are not discriminatory towards females, or I believe that some dress codes, when worded in particular ways, are discriminatory towards females, but are also discriminatory towards males. Okay, pick a position. You pick a pro, a con, and in the middle. Now, I will say that an in the middle or a qualifying essay is very difficult to write, but maybe we can do a stream on that later. So the essay will remain consistently worded as such. So I am very excited about that. Like I said, I think that's a huge bonus for you guys. There's no option to misinterpret what it is they're wanting you to do. You develop a position, they give you the topic, and you go from there. Okay, so that's your second paragraph. Analyze the sources, write an essay synthesizing material. Keep in mind it says at least 3 of the sources. That is a requirement. We will talk about that again, but you must have 3 sources cited in your essay. Okay, does anybody have any questions? I feel like this is a good place to ask, pause. Okay, keep in mind that there is a chat over to the right, so you can type things that you want to comment on, talk about. If you have a question that you think of as I'm talking, even if I don't address it immediately, go ahead and type it and submit it. That way, when we get to a pause, you don't forget it, okay? So definitely ask away over there if you have questions, and I will be happy to answer them. Okay, so paragraph 3 on the prompt used to have important reminders. Okay, so it used to say, I'm going to read you what it used to say, okay? Because I think this is still important information, regardless of whether it is not on there. It's still important for you to know this information. So it used to say, your argument should be the focus of your essay. Use the sources to develop your argument and explain the reasoning for it. Avoid merely summarizing the sources. Indicate clearly which sources you are drawing from, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. You may cite the sources as source A, source B, etc., or by using the descriptions in parentheses. Okay, so what you have on your prompt, and you'll see this in a minute, is a list of the sources labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, if there's an F. And then beside that, in parentheses, you have who wrote it or published it. Okay, so you can use either one of those to refer to your sources. As it says, you may cite them as source A, source B, or by using the descriptions in parentheses. Okay, so keep that in mind. All of that is great information, even though it's not on there anymore. Okay, so that paragraph 3 that I just read you is now gone from your prompt. So remember, you may paraphrase. So paraphrase is, I'm going to take this information and I'm going to keep it the same, but I'm going to put it in my own words. Okay, what we have to remember when paraphrasing is that we cannot misconstrue the information. So you cannot, I'm sure you've heard people say take things out of context. Sometimes when we take information, smaller pieces of information out of a larger picture, and we misinterpret them to mean something different, we don't want to do that, okay? So make sure when you're paraphrasing that it's your words, but it's still the idea that the author or the publisher was trying to share, okay? So make sure that when you paraphrase, you're not misconstruing information. Now, keep in mind, excuse me, I got to take a drink. It's cotton season here in Alabama, and it has not rained, and it's getting to me. Keep in mind that paraphrasing is probably the easiest because you're incorporating this information into your argument. So a lot of times when we try to direct quote, I refer to it with my students as quote bombs. So it's like they're talking, writing, they have their argument going, and then they just drop this bomb, and it's somebody else's information, and it doesn't make sense, and it's just slapped in there. And so I tell them, hey, why don't you try and paraphrase that? Because if you can make it if you can infuse your voice into that information, it will flow so much better with what you're writing. Okay. So I intentionally wrote paraphrase first on this list because that's my preference. Now, any of them are acceptable. Okay. But paraphrasing makes it easier to infuse your voice and still lead with your own argument. Okay. You may also summarize. So that is the idea that you take maybe large chunks of information and make them more concise. Okay. If I read one of the sources and it's, a whole page of information, several paragraphs, but there's just so much good stuff in there. You're on a time limit. You're on a time schedule. You got 40 minutes to write this essay. It is not worth it for you to copy, essentially, by direct quoting, lines and lines of information, okay? My rule for my students, and we have to work to get there because it's very difficult to do, I usually tell them that a direct quote should be 8 words or less. So that is not very much information. So if you have a source that you think is wonderful and you want to include a whole bunch of it, you should summarize. So take those large chunks of information, make them more concise, get your main ideas in this summary and include that instead of huge lines of text that you're copying because that takes forever. Again, that also kind of links back to that idea of paraphrasing because it's your voice. And so it's going to flow better with what you're writing. Okay. Now, there are times that you do need to direct quote. And so I tell my students, if you feel like you cannot take that information and change the wording because it's wonderful, it's great, maybe the author chose some really powerful language that you feel just really gets to the point of what you're trying to say, then direct quote it. Okay. But like I said, keep it short. And make sure that you don't just say the author says and drop it in there, okay? You have to embed your quotations if you're going to earn that point for sophistication, okay? You have to be able to embed those quotations. You have to use at least 3 sources. That is a minimum requirement. So if you do not use 3 sources, you will fail to qualify, okay? You have to use 3 of them. Now, do I suggest that you try and use all of them? No. The reason for that is because, again, if you are writing your argument, all of those are not going to fit into what you are trying to say. Now, if you were writing your own argument and you were seeking out information to justify your point, then maybe you could find 6 sources that say exactly what you want them to say. But the problem here is that you only have the 6 sources they give you, and they're not all going to back you up on what you're trying to say, okay? So obviously you have to use 3. I usually tell my students to use 4 at the max. So sometimes they will find 3 that they really like to use to justify their own point. but then they want to also include a counter argument, which is important as well. So they'll find a fourth source that goes against their point, and they'll use that fourth source as a counter argument. Okay, so at least 3. 4 is okay if you want to grab one for a counter argument. Don't try and use all 6 of them. Okay, if not only because they won't all justify what you're saying, then don't use all 6 of them because of time. Okay, now your time is continuous. So when you start that 40 minutes per essay, it's a chunk of 120 minutes. So you could write a really long synthesis and cut into that time for question 2, but then obviously you're shaving off time that you're going to have for questions 2 and 3. And I have students who, just write and write and write, and then they don't get to the end. So make sure that you're paying attention to that pacing as you go as well. Okay. Direct quotes, like I said, should be limited, short, concise, just the most important words. And make sure that you're varying what you do. So don't direct quote every single time, or don't paraphrase every single time. Again, that last point on your rubric now is called sophistication. And so it's these extra things that we can do to be better writers. And if I'm varying the way that I'm citing source material, then I'm going to be more successful when I'm writing this essay. Okay. And then finally, cite the sources as they're listed on your prompt page. The people who are reading your essay are trained to look for those citations. And so I've had students before who have cited the information. They used it from a source in their essay. And so they used those 3 sources that were required, but they didn't list the citation. Okay. I would hope that a reader would give you the benefit of the doubt if they knew that was source material, but they don't have to. You need to make sure that you're putting source A, source B, or the information that's in the parentheses so that they can check and make sure you have all 3 of those and you get credit for having those in your essay. Okay. So citing is just as important on this timed essay as it would be if I was writing an MLA style research paper and finding outside sources. Okay. You have to cite what you're using. All right. So here are my requirements. So this is what they are looking for when they're reading your synthesis. Sorry, got a little question over here. Will you be posting the link to the slides? Yes, ma'am. Okay, again, if you got questions, go ahead and ask them over there, and I'll stop periodically as I get a chance to address those. Okay, synthesis requirements. So you must respond to the prompt with a thesis that establishes a line of reasoning. Okay, this is a piece of the new rubrics that have been published in regards to AP language. Okay, and it says on there a thesis that establishes a line of reasoning. Now, I am going to be honest with you. You do not have to list out your reasons that you are going to talk about in your essay. We talk about the 3-part thesis where I say, I believe this because A, B, C. While you can do that, and you will likely get the thesis point for doing so, you do not have to do that. So you can imply a line of reasoning, or you can line out this line of reasoning. And we're going to look at 2 thesis statements at the end that both earned the point for thesis. One of them does the 3 parts and one of them doesn't, but they both got the point for thesis. So you can choose whether you want to do the more open-ended thesis or the closed thesis. For some of my students, they prefer that closed thesis because it helps them kind of give them a roadmap of where they're going. And so they can outline really in their thesis statement what their body paragraphs are going to be, and that just keeps them on track. So that's something to consider as well. You must include your 3 sources. We've talked about that. Indicate them clearly, label them, mark them. Explain the relationship between your source material and the thesis. I feel like this is where we struggle a lot, is making those connections. I say that 100 times a day to my students. Make the connection for your reader. It is not your reader's job to fill in the blanks or to fill in the holes. And you cannot assume that when you put your evidence in there from your source material, that they're going to come to the same conclusion that you did when you read that material. Your job is to get them there. So you must explain commentary, commentary, commentary. This is your explanation, your voice, your justification of using that evidence. Make that relationship clear to your reader. So why am I using this source material? How does this direct quotation or this paraphrase from source A prove the point that I have given you in my thesis statement? Okay, so make sure you're clearly explaining that relationship. Demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. Okay, so we know the rhetorical situation. We refer to it as space cat in my classroom. So space is S for subject, P for purpose, A, audience, C, context, E, exigence. So always remember that when you're thinking of this situation at large, and figure out how this situation fits within that rhetorical situation. Okay, audience, purpose, speaker. Use appropriate grammar and punctuation. Master your language usage. Again, this is where we have a huge opportunity to earn that sophistication point. You know, we do rhetorical analysis, we talk about rhetoric, we talk about rhetorical strategies, we analyze rhetorical strategies. Your argument and your synthesis are your chance to turn that around. So really, we're doing a rhetorical analysis backwards. You want to write a synthesis essay or an argument essay that someone can analyze and say, this is rhetorically genius. Okay, so you want to master your usage of language. They are not going to count you off significantly for grammar and punctuation unless it gets in the way of them understanding what you're trying to say. So, you know, if I read an essay that's full of sentence fragments and run-ons and it goes back and forth, and I'm trying to really understand what the point is they're trying to make because there's not a real sentence, then that may take a toll on the score. Okay, but if you just can't spell here or there, if you misplace a comma, not a huge deal. Okay, they're far more worried about your ideas than those types of things. Okay, questions again. Anybody have questions? Because we're about to dive in and look at some actual material. Okay, so go ahead and post them if you got them, and I will come back to that as I can. Okay, so here is a prompt. And so this is the one that I read you the third paragraph off of. So this is the old version of this particular prompt. Now, I will say that this prompt got re-released today. Okay, so it got re-released in the new fashion. So they have taken just a couple of prompts and revised them to match what they're going to look like on the new test this year. So you can Google search that. It should pop up. You should be able to look at it. But like I said, this particular version is the old version. Okay, so you see what you have. This is going to be the first page of your free response section. It'll tell you total time, 2 hours and 15 minutes, because that is your 3 essays of 40 minutes and your 15 minutes of reading time. And then it'll say suggested reading and writing time, 55 minutes. It is suggested, again, not required, but highly, highly, highly suggested that you spend 15 minutes reading the question, analyzing and evaluating the sources, and then 40 minutes writing your response. And make sure you don't go over that because you need that next 40 minutes for the next question, okay? So for this particular essay, the topic is eminent domain. So eminent domain is the power governments have to acquire property from private owners for public use. So if they are going to ask you about something that they feel like you may not know 100% what that means or what that idea is, they will give you that information. Okay, so eminent domain is when the government comes in to take property from private owners for public use. The rationale behind eminent domain is that governments have greater legal authority over lands within their dominion than do private owners. Eminent domain has been instituted in one way or another throughout the world for hundreds of years. So that's my exigence. That's my big idea. That's my topic. That's my subject. Obviously, I am writing my essay on eminent domain. Okay. And then they tell you to carefully read the following 6 sources, then synthesize material from at least 3 of the sources. And remember that it will say that develops your position on whether eminent domain is productive and beneficial. So that's what the standard wording will look like now. Whether eminent domain, develop your position on whether eminent domain is productive and beneficial. Okay. And then you see at the bottom there, so remember that third paragraph will be gone. It will no longer be there. And then you see at the bottom there how they have listed your sources. Okay. That information will be repeated. So at the beginning of each source, it will say source A, source B, source C, but it will also have who published it or who wrote it. And so that information in parentheses has been simplified here because on the actual sources, it's going to be within the citation. And so you'll have to kind of pull it out. And so this list just makes it a little bit easier to reference that. Okay, so one thing that I always like to tell my students is the implications of this idea I have to think about before I decide what path I'm going to take. And so I tell them to use this acronym called SEE IT. Okay, and I'm going to tell you what they all stand for, but I will tell you obviously the $ is money and the T at the end is time, because everything in our world revolves around time and money. So it's time and money on the ends and then all these other things in between. Okay, so let's talk about how to see the implications of the situation. So your money sign would be money in financial issues or ramifications. Okay, so eminent domain. What are the ramifications financially? Okay, how is it going to have a financial impact on someone if eminent domain is used to seize their property or seize their land? Okay, safety. What implications is this issue going to have on the vital safety of all involved? So if we'll just use a situation that I experienced personally. My grandmother lived in a house. The city used eminent domain to seize her home from her. Obviously, they compensated her, but they were building a shopping center. So they took her home to build a shopping center. Okay, so if I was thinking money, it would obviously be the compensation that she received versus the benefit that they were going to get in terms of maybe tax or commerce for the city. Safety may be, where's she going to go? What's she going to do? What safety are they going to use if they're, expanding this area and taking, a business straight up to a neighborhood? What are the safety implications? E is ethics. Now, all of these are not going to apply to every situation, but you're going to have some that stand out to you as soon as you see what topic you're writing about. So when you talk about money and financial issues, obviously important for eminent domain. When we talk about ethics, is this situation universally ethical or unethical? A big one, because a lot of what people argue is, you're going to come take my home to build a shopping center. How is that ethical? Okay, so that's a big one in terms of this idea also. E is environment. So what environmental issues or what is the impact on the environment when making a decision on this topic? Okay, are we taking people's homes, to preserve forest area or, maintain wildlife, or are we doing it to build a movie theater? What are the environmental issues? I is the international impact. A lot of times we live in our own little bubble here, especially in America. And so we need to think about, what is the effect on this worldwide? That may be important as something to consider, because in the prompt, they told you that it was something that had happened worldwide for hundreds of years. T, the first T is technology. So are there any technological impacts to be assessed by this topic? And then finally, the last one is time. So what are the effects of this issue regarding time? So I always suggest to my students that they pick a couple of these ideas to focus on based on what sticks out to them on that topic. So in this particular case, maybe you would talk about money, ethics, and environment. And so when you're thinking, okay, what is my argument? Am I for it or am I against it? Then you can talk about the implications or the ramifications. Okay, so I'm against eminent domain because it causes financial issues for people whose land is seized. I believe that it's universally unethical and it's not good for the environment because we are, denying people their homes and their neighborhoods for businesses and increasing traffic, and that has an environmental impact. So pick some things that stand out to you, but always keep in mind that see it idea, okay? Consider which of these implications affect this situation the most, and then that's going to give you a path to follow along for your writing. Okay. Anybody have questions at this point? Good to go? Okay. So decide your point of view or position on the topic before you read the sources. If you hear nothing else that I say tonight, hear this, because this is the most important thing, okay? They are looking for your voice and your argument. They are not looking for you to summarize the sources. They are not looking for you to side with what source A said or source C said. They are looking for you to come up with an argument. And really, that's all you're doing. You're writing an argument, and then you're injecting the source information as your evidence, okay? So before you flip that prompt page and start reading those sources, you write down your see it, you write down the implications that you want to consider, and you write down whether you're for, in this case, for eminent domain or against eminent domain. And then when you go to your source material, you find what backs up what you're already thinking. So you have to do some brainstorming before you start reading those sources, because if you don't, what's going to happen? So why is it so important that I think of what I'm going to do before I read the sources? Because that's how you do you. And they're not interested in how you do the source or how you copy the source or how you rewrite the source. They're interested in you thinking critically about this topic and then being able to be mature and sophisticated enough with your writing that you can incorporate that source information into something that you were already thinking, okay? Make sure you're leading with your thoughts, okay? List your thoughts down, do a little brainstorming before you dive into the sources provided. Probably going to regret saying this, okay? But I am not a brainstormer. I am not a brainstormer. It is so hard for me. And so I have sat down a lot of times with my students and given them a 40-minute prompt and sat and wrote it with them. And I've had to learn how to do this, okay? But it is so important if you're going to do something in 40 minutes that you have a plan. And brainstorming is that plan. It doesn't matter how you do it. It just matters that you do it. So make sure you list your thoughts down before you dive into that source information, okay? Here is a good little template that you can use just to get everything flowing, okay? I believe eminent domain should not be implemented because blank, 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 okay? It causes financial issues for those whose property is seized. It has a negative impact on our environment, and I believe it's ethically immoral, okay? Because blank, blank, blank. So if you will just use that little template right there just to get your thoughts going. Then that will help you when you're going through the information, okay? So when you do that, and then you are going to go to your source information, here are some things to keep in mind. You're not going to be able to annotate these sources the way that you're used to annotating things when you're doing rhetorical analysis, because there are so many of them. And especially on this particular prompt, they're really lengthy. So you don't have the time to annotate completely 7 sources. So you're reading through them with the idea that you want to gather information that's going to be important for you based on what you're writing. Okay, so you're going to mark portions of the sources with a plus or a negative. So you see something that's a pro, you mark it with a plus. Excuse me, you see something that's a con, you mark it with a negative. And so maybe put a bracket around it plus, or, you know, a little arrow and a negative. Avoid making too many marks because that's going to waste valuable time. You're not going to use all of that information. So you need to really just be marking out what stands out to you that you feel like is something you can use. And again, you may not end up using all of that, but definitely mark the things that you're like, yes, I like that. Yes, I want to use that, whatever it may be. Note statements, ideas, or observations that are particularly weighty. So again, you don't have a highlighter. You can't be highlighting this information, but you can underline or you can circle, but come up with a plan that works for you, a way that you can mark the information, because when you start writing, you're obviously going to have to go back and be able to find that information. So you want to mark it in some kind of way that will be helpful for you to go back and find it quickly when you need it. So here is why am I not switching here? Okay, so for 22, here is an example of a source that was given for this particular eminent domain prompt. Okay, so you see that you have that box that says source D, you have your citation information, and they always give you a little blurb in italics that kind of gives you a general idea of what this is. So the following is a case study excerpted from a report by a nonprofit research and education organization specializing in land use and real estate development. Okay, so right off the bat, I should already know in my head, this is somebody who specializes in land use and real estate development. So the idea probably here is that they're going to be for eminent domain, because they're going to want to take land to create real estate or to develop real estate. Okay, so I would mark this as a plus. So I might just put a little plus at the top. This is pro eminent domain, and then glance through and put brackets around anything that I feel like would be helpful in my argument. Okay, this is another one. This is source A. So as I said, some of them are very lengthy. There were a lot in this prompt that were very lengthy. The following is excerpted from an overview of eminent domain published on a federal website. So this is going to be more of an informational history of eminent domain, background of eminent domain. So this may be something that could be used either pro or con. And so I might have to really scrutinize this one a little bit more to figure out what information would be vital for me based on what I'm writing. Okay. You are typically always going to have an image, cartoon, chart, or graph, some kind of a visual within your sources. Visuals are very tricky because we have to interpret them. So it's not a situation like where we have text where they're giving us the information. They're giving us this image and we have to be able to interpret that and use it. So it's not required that you use the visual. And, you know, I've heard students tell me that other teachers or, you know, study sessions or things have told them that they score better if they use the visual, and that's not true. You have to have 3 sources. They're all weighted equally. You don't have to use the visual. So if you don't understand what it means, don't use it. Okay? Don't use it. If you look at it and you think, okay, I don't know what that means, or I don't know how that would help me, use 3 other sources. Okay? Often it's difficult to interpret them in a way that proves to be vital to your argument. So you might be able to find a way to interpret it that would be helpful, but it's not going to be like the nail in the coffin. It's not going to be the thing that gets you over the edge to a great score if you're not sure what it means. Okay. This is the one that was given on this particular eminent domain prompt. It says the following cartoon was published in a nationally syndicated comic strip. Having defeated the wolf, the three little pigs lose their house to a greater foe. What the heck's eminent domain? What the heck's a Walmart? Okay, so I had some students who understood this. I had some who didn't. I had some that wrote crazy things about, being able to go to Walmart and rebuild their house made the three little pigs fans of eminent domain, which is not the intent of this comic strip. Okay, so make sure that you understand it if you're going to try and incorporate it into your essay. Okay. All right, so that's a look at some of the sources. Now let's look at how we can cite information from the sources. So I've taken some actual words from the source information and I have embedded them. So the idea, like I said, is that you don't want to just drop quotes into your essay. You want to make sure that you are making it flow and making it work with the way that you speak or the way that you write. Okay. Otherwise, it's very awkward and clunky. And it's just, it doesn't look good. It's not going to earn you that sophistication point, and we want to strive for that. Okay. So here's how I would do a direct quotation. So this is when an author's actual words are quoted. So according to Carney, corporatism is not merely capitalism or socialism, but the idea that profits provided by the market aren't sufficient motivation. Therefore, governments must put some icing on top. Now, I didn't want to break my own rule about using 8 words or less, so I broke up that lengthy direct quotation and put a word in between there so that it's woven into my own sentence. Okay, so that is an actual citation with the author's words quoted. Now, if I were to paraphrase or to indirectly cite that same information, I may say, according to Carney, the idea of corporatism allows the government to offer incentives in addition to profits. Okay, so that's the same idea, but I've put it in my own words so that I can incorporate it into what I'm writing rather than using the actual direct words of the author. So either way is fine, but like I said, make sure that you're varying it up a little bit so that you're not doing the same thing every time. Okay. Now, here are some parenthetical attributions. So here is what we're going to do to make sure that they know we're citing. So direct quote or direct citation with my source information. Eminent domain harms the poor because most of the people displaced were left even worse than they were before. Source C. So that is where that information came from. Okay, that's my citation to prove to you, here's my first source that I'm using. Check off one of them. So a paraphrase of the same thing. Eminent domain has a greater impact on poor and minorities because they are often left off worse than they were before once their property has been seized. Source C. So it still came from the same source. I've just taken that information and put it into my own words. Okay, but I'm still going to cite source C because I didn't come up with that myself. I just took what they said and put it into my own words. So don't get in trouble with your paraphrases. A lot of times we think, well, if I read this and then I just kind of think about it and write it in my own words, it's not really plagiarizing because I thought about it. No, it's still plagiarizing. If you put it in your own words, but it came from someone else, it's still not yours. So make sure you cite it. Now you can do either of those with that information that comes from the bibliographic citation. So that's what they give you in that parentheses. So same quote. Eminent domain has a greater impact on poor and minorities because they are often left off worse than they were before once their property has been seized. Soman. Okay, so just make sure that you choose one, and I usually say stick with it. So if you're going to go with the ABC, always go with the ABC. If you're going to go with that bibliographic citation with the name, always go with that same one. The only reason for that is because these people are human. And if they're used to you using A, B, and C, and then you swap it up on them, they may miss it. And you may miss qualifying because you didn't use enough sources. Okay, so stick with it. Now, let's talk really quickly, so we're going to run out of time here soon, about this idea of thesis. And so on the new rubric, the very first line is thesis. And so you either get a point because you have a defensible thesis. And please notice that on the right side, it says may establish a line of reasoning. So I talked about that in the beginning. You can have that closed thesis or you can have an open thesis. Either one of those, as long as they're defensible, are going to get you that point. But you may not get a point if there's no defensible thesis. If the intended thesis restates the prompt, so if you just take the line that they're giving you about defending a position and put it in there, that's not a thesis. The intended thesis provides a summary of the issue with no apparent or coherent claim. So maybe you just write that you're talking about eminent domain, or there is a thesis, but it does not respond to the prompt. So if they're asking you to talk about whether eminent domain is beneficial, for example, you have to write a thesis that makes a claim on that particular idea. You can't just write a thesis about eminent domain in general because it's not responding to the prompt, okay? So let's look at a couple of thesis statements, okay? So here are some point earners. So the very top one is a point earner. It got the point on the rubric for thesis. Although eminent domain can be misused to benefit private interest at the expense of citizens, it is a vital tool of any government that intends to have influence on the land it governs beyond that of written law. So that is an open thesis. They didn't outline for me their 1, 2, 3 ideas, okay, but they do make clear and have a defensible argument about eminent domain. This particular essay also got the sophistication point at the end. And I think you can kind of see how that's nuanced. They addressed the counter argument right there at the beginning instead of just letting it go or ignoring it. And so that's a very well-written, open-ended thesis statement. Here is one that also got the point, and it's more of that 3-part idea. So while there are many who argue the eminent domain can be used to revitalize, the power often exploits lower income areas, violates Fifth Amendment rights, and often fails at the intended good. So they've kind of outlined that roadmap of where they're going in their essay. Now, this next one down here at the bottom did not get the thesis point because it's not defensible. And not only that, but there's some other issues with it. Both cases are right. Eminent domain is a two-sided coin. Eminent domain is good and bad, depending on what side you stand on and how it affects you or others. Obviously, sentence fragment, spelling issues, several issues here, but they're also not really stating a point. They're kind of saying, well, it can be good and it can be bad, and it depends on what you think and your experience. And so they haven't really made a claim. They're kind of just meandering through the ideas that they're thinking, okay? So those are 2 that earned the point and 1 that did not. Okay, so just as a summary here before we run out of time, things to avoid. Do not begin a paragraph with source information. Begin it with a claim or a topic sentence. Do not summarize the sources as the meat of your paper. Make sure that your argument is in charge. Do not allow your paper to be a majority of source information. It needs to be the reverse. It needs to be the majority of your argument, your commentary, your explanation, your voice with the source information backing you up, okay? Do lead with your own argument and allow the source information to provide that justification for your reasoning. Do craft topic sentences that are based on the source information that you plan to include. That is fine. You can use them to help guide you. Just don't use them to start your paragraph. And make sure you have twice as much commentary and explanation as source information, because you need to remember that this is your essay. Your essay, okay? All right, just in time. I hope that you have enjoyed this, that I've answered some of your questions, given you an overview, so that you feel a little more comfortable with what you're supposed to do in synthesis. Okay, thanks for joining me tonight. Please join me on the 7th for Article of the Month, and hopefully we can live stream and write a synthesis together later on. Okay, thank you all. Have a good night.